to Valkyrie. The retired four-star general slowly lifted his crystal glass above the ballroom. Within seconds, every conversation stopped. More than 200 guests turned toward the stage. The chandeliers reflected against polished uniforms, medals, and champagne glasses as complete silence settled over the room. Then the general smiled. There isn't a person in this room whose career wasn't protected because of her. The words struck the room like thunder. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then every chair scraped across the polished floor. Military officers, retired generals, Pentagon officials, defense executives. One after another, they all stood. The applause became overwhelming. Glasses clinked. People smiled. Some even wiped away tears. Every face slowly turned toward one person. Me. Across the table, my husband, Richard, suddenly coughed into his bourbon. Violently. His face lost every trace of color. Only 20 minutes earlier, as we entered the ballroom, he had leaned close enough that no one else could hear. "Please don't embarrass me tonight." He glanced around the room before adding, "These people are way above your level." I remembered every single word, standing there while the applause echoed around us. I couldn't help wondering if he remembered them too. But to understand why that room erupted into applause, you first have to understand the 35 years that came before it. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old. I served 31 years in the United States Army. Most of my career was spent in military intelligence. There are still assignments I cannot discuss. Operations that remain classified. People whose identities will never become public. Decisions that changed lives without anyone outside a secure room ever knowing. But this story isn't really about classified missions. It's about something much more ordinary. Something that quietly destroys relationships every day. It's about becoming invisible. Especially to the person who should know you best. Richard and I had been married for 35 years. We met when life was still simple. Before promotions. Before children. Before mortgages. Before retirement plans. Back then, he admired my determination. Whenever someone thanked me for serving, he looked genuinely proud. He attended military ceremonies, pinned medals onto my uniform, sent handwritten letters during deployments. For many years, I truly believed we were partners. Then something slowly changed. Not overnight. Not after one argument. It happened so gradually that neither of us noticed at first. After retiring from the Army, Richard built a successful career in defense consulting. He was talented, confident, excellent at building relationships. People enjoyed being around him. His professional reputation continued growing year after year. Soon our mailbox filled with invitations. Military galas, charity dinners, defense conferences, networking events, fundraisers, Washington receptions. Richard loved every one of them. As his reputation expanded, mine quietly disappeared. At first it seemed harmless. Someone would ask about my career. Before I could answer, Richard would smile and say, "Oh, Evelyn worked for the government." 5 simple words. 31 years reduced to a single sentence. I usually smiled. There didn't seem much point correcting him. Later, the comments became jokes. "You probably shouldn't ask Evelyn what she did." He'd laugh. "She might have to eliminate us afterward." Everyone laughed, including me, the first few times. Eventually, the joke stopped being funny. One evening we attended a dinner hosted by retired military officers. A former colonel asked where I had served. Before I could speak, Richard answered, "Nothing particularly exciting." The colonel politely nodded. I forced a smile. Inside, something quietly broke. Nothing exciting? I'd spent years away from home. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings. I watched my children grow up through photographs mailed overseas. I carried responsibilities I could never explain to my own family. Nothing exciting? Still, I stayed silent. Correcting him would only create another uncomfortable conversation later. So I convinced myself it wasn't important. But small dismissals accumulate over time, like water slowly carving stone. Then the invitation arrived. The annual Defense Leadership Gala, one of the most respected military gatherings in the region. Retired generals, senior Pentagon officials, decorated veterans, government leaders, the people who had spent their lives protecting the country. Richard looked genuinely excited. We should definitely attend. I smiled faintly. You mean you should attend? He looked surprised. No. You can come with me. You can come with me. Not. We'll go together. Not. I'd love us to attend. Just. You can come. As though I were simply accompanying him. Like an accessory. For a long moment, I studied his face. He had no idea what he'd just said. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. The week before the gala, I seriously considered staying home. Part of me wanted to avoid another evening of introductions where I became little more than someone's wife. Then another thought quietly appeared. I was tired. Not angry. Simply tired. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of defending accomplishments that never needed defending. Tired of reminding people who I had been. Especially the man who should have remembered. So I made a decision. I would attend. I would wear my evening gown, smile politely, enjoy the evening, and I would stop correcting anyone. If people recognized me, wonderful. If they didn't, that was perfectly fine too. I wasn't attending to impress anyone. My value had never depended on recognition. The evening finally arrived. Richard adjusted his tuxedo in front of the mirror. I stood beside him wearing a simple navy evening dress. He barely glanced at me. When we entered the grand ballroom glowing beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, he leaned closer and whispered one final reminder. Please don't embarrass me. His eyes swept across the room. These people are way out of your league. I looked at him, smiled, and said absolutely nothing. Because in less than 30 minutes, every person inside that ballroom would remind my husband of something he had forgotten years ago. Exactly who his wife really was. The ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Rows of decorated uniforms reflected the warm golden light. Soft jazz floated through the room while waiters moved quietly between tables carrying trays of champagne. Richard walked confidently from one conversation to the next. I followed a few steps behind him. Not because I wanted to, because that was simply how the evening unfolded. Everywhere we stopped, people greeted him warmly. Defense executives, retired officers, government officials, consultants. He smiled, shook hands, exchanged stories, and accepted compliments as though he belonged at the center of every conversation. Whenever someone noticed me, the introduction was always the same. This is my wife, Evelyn. Nothing else. No mention of 31 years in uniform. No mention of military intelligence. No mention of the countless sacrifices that shaped my life. Simply, my wife. At one point, a retired Navy admiral joined our group. He smiled warmly. So, Evelyn, what line of work were you in? I had barely opened my mouth when Richard answered. Government work. The admiral laughed politely. That's a pretty broad description. Richard grinned. She never likes talking about it. Everyone chuckled. I smiled the way I always had. Calm. Polite. Silent. Because correcting him in front of strangers would only create an uncomfortable moment. Still, inside, something felt painfully familiar. It wasn't that strangers didn't know who I was. It was that the man standing beside me had slowly forgotten. After excusing myself, I walked toward one of the large windows overlooking Washington. Outside, city lights stretched across the night like scattered stars. A waiter passed with champagne. I accepted a glass and stood quietly, enjoying a rare moment alone. People often imagine classified military work as something exciting. The truth is very different. Most of it is quiet, lonely, invisible. There are no cameras, no interviews, no applause, only responsibility. Years before retiring, I served on a specialized intelligence task force during an international crisis. The details remain protected even today. What I can say is this. Several senior military leaders were preparing to act based on intelligence that turned out to be dangerously inaccurate. Had those decisions gone forward, entire careers might have collapsed. Operations could have failed. Lives might have been placed at unnecessary risk. A small team of us spent weeks reviewing reports, comparing information, questioning assumptions, looking for the smallest inconsistencies. Eventually, we found the mistake. More importantly, we proved it. The corrected intelligence prevented a disaster very few people would ever know had almost happened. When the mission ended, there were no celebrations, no interviews. We simply returned to work. That's what professionals did. The mission mattered. Recognition never did. A burst of laughter brought me back to the present. Across the ballroom, Richard was entertaining another group of guests. He looked confident, comfortable, important. As I watched him, someone suddenly stopped walking. Completely stopped. He appeared to be around 70. Tall, straight-backed. Even retirement hadn't changed the posture of a career military officer. For a moment he simply stared at me. Then his face broke into a wide smile. "Evelyn Carter?" I blinked, then smiled back. "General Grayson." He laughed warmly. "My goodness. I haven't seen you in almost 15 years. We shook hands. It felt like greeting another chapter of my life. We spent several minutes talking, mostly about grandchildren, retirement, family, the simple things people appreciate after spending decades carrying enormous responsibility. But behind every word, I recognized something else. Respect. The quiet kind earned over many years. Not long afterward, another retired officer joined us. Then another. Soon I found myself surrounded by old colleagues I hadn't seen in decades. Every one of them remembered. Not my title. Not my rank. Me. Across the room, I noticed Richard watching. His expression looked puzzled. He couldn't understand why so many senior officers were walking directly toward me. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He approached our group. General Grayson smiled politely. Richard. They shook hands briefly. Then, without missing a beat, the general turned back toward me. "So tell me, how are your grandchildren doing?" Richard stood quietly beside us while the conversation continued. No one intentionally ignored him, but everyone wanted to speak with me. The irony almost made me smile. For years, Richard believed my military career had been little more than paperwork. Yet some of the most respected leaders in the room clearly remembered something very different. Still, he didn't seem worried, only confused, as though he believed they were simply being polite. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. A few minutes later, a soft bell echoed through the ballroom. Guests slowly returned to their assigned tables. The evening program was about to begin. Richard relaxed in his chair beside me. "I guess your old coworkers were happy to see you." I smiled. "They were." He nodded casually. "Nothing more." The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The chairman stepped onto the stage. Conversations faded. More than 200 guests turned toward the podium. The chairman adjusted the microphone, then smiled. Before we continue with tonight's program, I'd like to recognize someone very special. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Across the ballroom, General Grayson quietly looked toward me. Our eyes met. He smiled. In that instant, I understood. Something had been planned. And somehow, no one had told me. The chairman continued. Many years ago, a small group of military professionals prevented one of the most serious intelligence failures many of us would ever face. The room grew noticeably quieter. Richard continued sipping his bourbon, still completely unaware. The chairman turned toward the front row. General Matthews, a retired four-star general, slowly rose from his seat. The room instinctively straightened. Some habits never disappear around four-star officers. He accepted the microphone, then lifted his crystal glass. Looking around the ballroom, he smiled warmly. To Valkyrie. The nickname echoed through the room. Immediately, dozens of familiar faces smiled. People remembered. The applause began quietly, then spread from table to table until the entire ballroom erupted. Richard lowered his drink. Confusion covered his face. He looked around the room, then at me, then back toward the stage. He still had no idea that Valkyrie was the woman sitting beside him. The applause continued far longer than I expected. One by one, every guest in the ballroom stood. Retired generals, senior Pentagon officials, decorated veterans, defense leaders. More than 200 people applauded with genuine respect. I lowered my eyes for a moment, wishing I could disappear into the crowd. Recognition had never been something I sought. I had simply done my job. Across the table, Richard sat frozen. His bourbon glass remained suspended halfway to his lips. He looked around the room in complete disbelief. General Matthews smiled as the applause slowly faded. Then he spoke again. Many of you already know the story. Soft laughter spread through the ballroom. He pointed gently in my direction. She would never tell it herself. More smiles. That was true. I never had. The general continued. 20 years ago, an intelligence review uncovered critical errors that threatened careers, missions, and national security. The room became silent again. There are people sitting here tonight who would have lost everything if those mistakes had not been discovered. Several retired officers quietly nodded. Then General Matthews raised his glass once more. And the woman responsible for uncovering the truth is sitting right there. He looked directly at me. Evelyn Carter. A second standing ovation filled the ballroom, even louder than the first. For several long moments, I couldn't move. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't proud. Mostly, I felt humbled. Because military service was never about recognition. It was about responsibility. General Matthews smiled warmly. The most remarkable part isn't what Colonel Carter accomplished. He paused. It's that after everything was over, she quietly returned to work and never asked for a single ounce of credit. The room applauded once again. This time, I noticed tears in the eyes of several retired officers. Some of them remembered those difficult months. Some had lived through them. Others simply understood what quiet service truly meant. As the program continued, guests began leaving their tables. One after another, they approached me. A retired admiral shook my hand. It's an honor to see you again, Colonel. A former Pentagon director smiled warmly. I've wanted to thank you for years. Another retired officer laughed. I probably wouldn't have retired with my rank if it hadn't been for your team. Each conversation felt sincere, respectful, natural. Across the room, Richard watched every interaction. For years, he had introduced me as someone who simply worked for the government. Now many of the most accomplished military leaders in the country were waiting patiently just to speak with me. Not because I had asked, because they remembered. Eventually, General Grayson reached our table. He smiled warmly before shaking my hand. "It's wonderful seeing you again, Colonel." Then he turned toward Richard. For a brief moment, I expected a polite conversation. Instead, the general smiled with genuine surprise. "Richard, why have you never told anyone your wife was Evelyn Carter?" The question landed harder than any criticism ever could. Several nearby guests laughed softly, not to embarrass Richard. They simply couldn't believe it. Richard opened his mouth. No words came out. For perhaps the first time during our marriage, he had absolutely nothing to say. General Grayson gently patted his shoulder, then looked back at me. "The chairman would like you to join us at the front table." I blinked. "Me?" He smiled. "They've been hoping you'd come all evening." As I stood, I looked toward Richard. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He simply looked lost, as though he had suddenly realized he knew less about his wife than complete strangers did. Oddly enough, that realization hurt me more than all the careless jokes he'd made over the years. The drive home passed in complete silence. Not the peaceful silence of two people who understand each other. The heavy kind. The kind filled with thoughts neither person knows how to begin. The lights of Washington slipped past outside the windshield. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Richard finally spoke. "Evelyn." "Yes." His hands tightened around the steering wheel. "I honestly didn't know." I turned toward him. "You didn't know what?" He swallowed. "Any of it." The sadness in his voice sounded genuine. But after 35 years, those words also felt painfully late. "You never asked," I replied quietly. He didn't argue, because deep inside, he knew I was right. When we arrived home, neither of us changed clothes. Neither of us went to bed. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table where we had spent decades raising children, paying bills, celebrating birthdays, and planning our future. Tonight, it felt like two strangers sharing the same room. Richard stared at his hands. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded politely, but remained silent. An apology was important. Understanding mattered even more. After several moments, he looked up. "What happened to us?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked. Because he truly didn't know. I folded my hands together. "You never stopped loving me." Relief briefly crossed his face. Then I finished. "But you stopped seeing me." The relief disappeared. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I asked, "Do you know what hurt me most?" "The jokes." "No." "The comments." "No." He looked confused. "What hurt most," I said softly, "was realizing that complete strangers understood my life better than my own husband." The room became completely still. I wasn't accusing him. I was simply describing the truth. I told him about every interrupted conversation, every introduction where I disappeared, every moment someone asked me a question only for Richard to answer instead. Not once. Hundreds of times. When I finished, he looked exhausted. "I never meant to make you feel invisible." I know. That was exactly the tragedy. He had never intended to hurt me. He simply stopped paying attention. The following morning, the phone rang. Then it rang again. General Grayson. A retired admiral. Former colleagues. Old friends. Each conversation reminded Richard of something he had never truly understood. Around lunchtime, he quietly asked, "What exactly did you do?" Not sarcastically. Not joking. Not dismissively. For the first time in decades, he genuinely wanted to know. That afternoon, we sat together for hours. I couldn't reveal classified operations, but I shared the human side of military life. The long deployments, the missed holidays, the responsibility, the loneliness, the friendships, the sacrifices. He listened without interrupting, without changing the subject, without checking his phone. simply listening. At one point, tears filled his eyes. I had no idea. I know, I answered. Change didn't happen overnight. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand gestures, just small moments. Breakfast conversations. Questions he'd never asked before. Old photographs spread across the dining room table. One afternoon, he found a picture from the day I was promoted to colonel. He studied it quietly. I can't believe I forgot how important this day was. I smiled gently. You didn't forget. He looked at me. You stopped noticing. He nodded. This time, he didn't defend himself. Because he understood. Weeks slowly turned into months. Our conversations became deeper, more honest. One evening, we attended a small veterans appreciation event. Nothing glamorous. Just local veterans sharing stories. A woman approached us. What branch did you serve in? Before I could answer, Richard smiled proudly. My wife served in the United States Army for 31 years. The woman looked impressed. Richard continued. You should hear everything she accomplished. I looked at him. For years, I had waited to hear words like those. Not because I needed praise. Because I needed to feel seen. As the woman walked away, Richard quietly looked at me. I finally understand something. What? The most extraordinary person in my life has been sitting beside me all along. I laughed softly. It only took you 35 years. He smiled. I know. Standing there together, I realized something important. The gala hadn't saved our marriage. Recognition hadn't saved it. Applause hadn't saved it. The truth had. Listening had. Choosing to truly see each other again had. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all.